Welcome to Let's Talk Humanitarian, Parlons Humanitaire, enriching conversations with humanitarian workers and humanitarian leaders to open eyes, heart, and mind. This is a program by KALU Institute, your online center for humanitarian aid studies, where humanitarians train humanitarians. My name is Amélie Yanguifes, and I'm really delighted to host this conversation with Kamal Kishore, member of the National Disaster Management Authority of the Government of India. Hello, good morning, Kamal. Thank you for being here with us.
Good morning. Good morning. Glad to be here with you talking.
Thank you, Kamal. I'm going to introduce you before diving into our topic of disaster management and disaster management in India. You've worked on disaster and climate risk management issues for over 20 years. At national, regional, and global levels. And prior to joining the National Disaster Management Authority in India, you worked with UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, for nearly 13 years in New Delhi, Geneva, and New York. You'll tell us after a little more about all that. At the UNDP headquarters, you led the global advocacy campaigns to address disaster risk reduction concerns in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and the post-2015 development agenda. As a program advisor, you also led the development of disaster and climate risk management related elements of the UNDP strategic plan for 2014 to 2017. Previously, you've been with UNDP, you were the regional advisor for South and Southwest Asia, where you supported more than 10 countries on public policy, institutional development issues. You also advised them on the use of appropriate disaster risk reduction tools and methodologies. You've supported post-disaster recoveries through strategic advice, needs assessment, program development, and coordination after major disasters in Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Iran, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, the Philippines, and also Sri Lanka. You served also Asian Disaster Preparedness Center as Director of Information and Research. This was before UNDP. You were the manager of the Extreme Climate Events Program that was covering Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And before that, you were with Action Research Unit for Development in India, working on post-disaster reconstruction and resettlement after the two major earthquakes, the Uttarkashi and the Latur earthquakes in 1991 and 1993. So, Kamal, can you tell us what drove you to work in the disaster field? I understand your educational background is, you are an architect. So
Yes.
how did you get into the disaster management field?
So I think it was a mix of chance and also discovery. When I was studying architecture in the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, that was in early 90s. In 1991, there was an earthquake in Uttarkashi, which is, 7-8 hours drive in those days in the Himalayas from Roorkee. And the earthquake happened just a couple of weeks after I had been trekking there. So after the earthquake, I thought I should do something. And then I started to work with some local organizations on temporary shelters while I was still a student. And soon after that, I finished my degree. And then there was an NGO looking for architects who could go and live in a village and help rebuild earthquake-resistant houses using, to the maximum extent possible, local materials. So I started working there, living and working in a village where we built a small village, 37 families only. And then by the time I finished that, there was another earthquake. This was now in Maharashtra, 1993. So I started working there. So I was essentially applying my architectural skills, learning a little bit of earthquake engineering to do non-engineered earthquake-resistant houses. But very soon I saw that, risk reduction is not just about buildings. It's also about governance. It's also about community involvement. There are a whole range of policy issues, program issues, governance issues that underpin safety. So I drifted, or I evolved from being an architect to a disaster risk management with a wider perspective of disaster risk management issues.
So interesting. Thank you, Kamal, for sharing this journey with us, because I understand also you have been able to develop in terms of policy and seeing the bigger pictures, because you've started in the field. So important not to really experience the field and know what are the questions that are the most important when we are in the field and when we need to save lives, build back better, and recover from disasters. So Kamal, we mentioned at the beginning more than 20 years, but it's actually 30 years, almost 30 years of experience in the field of the disaster management. Could you tell us what is the evolution that you have observed, the big trends all along these 30 years?
I can say that over the 30 years, the field of disaster risk management has come a really long way. It has evolved a lot. And let me highlight three key things which basically define this evolution. So when I started working in this field, so for the first one, when I started working in this field, in the decade of 90s, it was called, there was an international decade, UN International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, UNIDNDR, which concluded in 1999 with the global event, which was held in Geneva. Now, you would notice that that decade was called International Decade of Natural Disaster Reduction. So one key evolution that has happened is that we have permanently dropped the word natural from disasters. Now we recognize that disasters are not natural. Hazards may be natural. An earthquake may be natural. A cyclone may be natural. But it becomes a disaster because of a whole range of human actions. An earthquake which happens somewhere in the sea and affects nobody is just a natural hazard. It's not a disaster. It becomes a disaster when there are people living in earthquake-prone areas. And when people living in earthquake-prone areas are living in buildings which are weak buildings, which cannot withstand earthquakes. So living in the earthquake-prone areas and making weak buildings are human actions. So essentially, disasters are all man-made. So I think that's one key change that has happened. It is widely accepted and recognized that something happens in our society, in our social, economic, political, cultural system, which turns a hazard into a disaster. So that's a big realization. And in the same vein, let me just highlight one more thing. The second point, which is that when we looked at the technical advisory committee or scientific and technical committee of the IDNDR, except for one person, if I recall correctly, all of them were from the natural sciences. So there were earthquake experts, there were cyclone experts, there were volcanologists, there were meteorologists. So it was all driven from the natural sciences end. So there were engineers and scientists, except for one or maybe two people at that time. And now it has become a much more broad-based thing where you have a lot of social sciences people, behavioral scientists working in it, governance specialists working in it. Now we realize that it is no longer enough to treat disaster risk management as a narrow physical sciences problem, understanding how earthquakes occur or how cyclones occur. But why do we live in earthquake-prone areas? And if we have to live in earthquake-prone areas, why do we make weak buildings? Do we don't have the capacity? Do we don't have the governance mechanism to enforce a regulation? So once you open that up, it really has to become a much broader field. The third evolution, which is relatively recent, one can say, in the last few years, is a movement towards taking a systemic approach. We can no longer look at disasters or impact of disasters in an isolated way in one location, in one sector. And the current pandemic is really highlighting how impacts can ripple across the world, ripple across different infrastructure systems, not just within a country, but across the world. We are a more interconnected, interdependent world. So a systemic approach is really key. In a cyclone-prone area, when a power system, electricity supply is disrupted, it's not just the electricity supply that is affected. If you don't have electricity, the telecom system will go down as well, because the power backup, will not last beyond a few hours. If the telecom system goes down, then your ATM machines will not work. Yeah. If your ATM machines don't work, then people who are not even looking for assistance, they just want to draw their own cash. They won't have access to cash. When you don't have cash, markets stop functioning. Manufacturing units stop functioning. So it is really important to take a systemic view. So these three changes, dropping the naturalness of so-called natural disasters and asserting that they're all man-made, there are no natural disasters. Second is much greater play of social sciences. And the third is evolution of systemic approaches. These are the three big milestones that I have observed over the last 3 decades.
Well, thank you so much, Kamal, for this information. What do you think? Because you were in the middle of that. I mean, in your different roles, you were clearly an actor of these milestones. What do you think has been instrumental so that we are able to reach this result? Like acknowledging that it's not so natural, but it's made by us. Then ensuring that we have a systemic approach to disaster management. What do you think has been key? Policy, advocacy, legislation, regulations or international documents that push and oblige us to take action? Or what do you think has been really important here?
See, I think there have been 3 things that have influenced this. Of course, one is that the decade of natural disaster reduction in the 90s, followed by the Hyogo framework faction, and now Sendai framework. These frameworks, before Hyogo in 1994, during the decade of natural disaster reduction, we had the Yokohama strategy. So we've had these 3 important global frameworks: Yokohama strategy, Hyogo framework, and now Sendai framework. So all of these have definitely helped raise the awareness of disaster issues. They have really highlighted the importance of these issues for the fundamental well-being of our society, our world, the humanity, and not just something you do as an add-on. So that is one very clear contribution that has come. The second thing that has been there is that despite a lot of development in meteorological sciences, in earthquake sciences, there was a time when it was being observed that despite these advances, we are not really being able to reduce losses, especially economic losses, livelihood losses, to the extent we had hoped to. So obviously something was not really adding up. And that came to a realization that maybe we are not looking at the problem in its totality, or maybe we are just looking at the wrong end of the problem too much. So, of course, it is important to understand how earthquakes occur, where they occur, how strong they can be, how frequent they can be. But it is also important to understand where people live, how do they build, what governs how they build, why do people live in coastal areas? If they live in coastal areas, why are they not being able to build wind-resistant structures? What is the governance system there? So I think that realization that we have to go beyond just looking at the engineering or physical science side of the problem to be able to reduce losses. That's the second thing. The third thing which has happened is really over the last 2 decades, or even more, 2.5 decades perhaps, a much greater emphasis on people's agency, on community-based approaches to disaster risk management. We no longer look at communities as victims. We look at them as principal actors of disaster risk management. They have to be in the driving seat. They are not subjects of our interventions. They are principal actors. And if we want to work with communities, we have to use what exists at the community level before or after a disaster as the starting point. It's people's resources, their imagination, their initiative. That is the most important thing. That is the starting point, not an external intervention, not an external input. So I think these three things, the role of the frameworks, our inability to reduce losses despite scientific advancements, and much greater focus on community-based work, people's agency, people's voices, these have brought about the transformations that I just outlined a few minutes ago.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kamal, to highlight the importance, actually of the community being actors of the recovery, of the response, and also of the risk reduction and the risk the risk management as a whole. Now you are working with the National Disaster Management Authority. So now you're in the government, and you've brought to this government wealth of experiences and knowledge and this global perspective and this systemic approach to disaster management. So can you tell us a little about your role, and including I guess there must be one part very exciting when you can be in a government and have this direct influence with the communities, but also at policy level, etc., and also challenges. Can you tell us what are those?
So let me answer that in 3 parts. First, I will talk a little bit about my role. Second, the opportunities, and the third, I will talk about challenges. My role, I work for India's apex authority. It's called National Disaster Management Authority. It's lead agency for disaster risk management in the country, somewhat similar to FEMA in the United States. And as the lead agency, it lays down policies, plans, and guidelines, both horizontally to be followed by other ministries and departments of the central government, but also for emulation or following up by the states and district level. Of course, with a lot of flexibility for the states and districts to cater to their own unique context. India is a large country with a very wide range of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability context. So you can't have one size fits for all, but overall normative guidance is provided by the NDMA. We also work quite directly with states on specific issues. We have perhaps the world's largest cyclone risk mitigation program, and we've been able to reduce losses by several orders of magnitude over the last 15 years or so. We have a similar program on landslides, earthquakes, but also not just hazard-wise program, but integrated multi-hazard programs as well. So that's in brief my role. In terms of the excitement or opportunity, I think the biggest opportunity while working for the government is to have a really big picture view and to be able to bring together resources, capacities of multiple sectors together and really sort of craft a new narrative in the policy making as well as in implementation in promoting comprehensive approach to disaster risk management. Let me illustrate that with a couple of examples. So over the last few years, we've worked very closely with the Finance Commission of India, which basically allocates resources from the central revenues to the states, including for disaster risk management. And we've been able to completely revolutionize the way the Finance Commission has, I mean, the credit goes to Finance Commission for revolutionizing, but we've had technical support to it in the way disaster risk management financing works for the country, which is essentially characterized by not just allocating money for post-disaster response, but also for prevention. Not just for immediate response, but also for recovery and reconstruction, also for capacity building and preparedness. So, that the kind of change that can happen as a result of it has huge, far-reaching implications. It's not just something which affects us over a few years, it's for decades. So I think the opportunity to bring about systemic long-term changes is there while working with the government. And all the experience that I've had globally, I've been able to sort of bring that together and direct them to the service of my own country. The second example, internationally, over the last 2-3 years, recognizing the systemic nature of risk, we've been able to launch under our Prime Minister's leadership, a global coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. As of date, we have 22 countries and a variety of countries from all across the world, and 7 international organizations coming together and looking at how we can make infrastructure resilient to the risks, not just as they stand now, but also future risks. So I think these kinds of ambitious, large-scale things can be done if one puts one's mind to it within the government.
I wanted to ask you, what is again the name of this coalition?
Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI.
Okay. Excellent. Because when I was hearing all these achievements, I thought so interesting indeed what you have been able to achieve with the finance part, which is a big topic, all over. So how do you share that? So what I hear is creating coalition, and within ASEAN
That's
also,
right.
you have some sharing of experiences with the different governments.
Yes, with ASEAN, with SAARC, with BIMSTEC, we've been sharing. So government to government cooperation bilaterally with a number of countries. Our cooperation with Nepal in the context of post-earthquake recovery after the 2015 earthquake. So many opportunities like that. The challenge of working in the government system is that as one can perhaps call the government as preeminent domain or a key pillar of governance. Although I must say that all governance is not government. Governance is a broader concept, but government is a key pillar of risk governance. So as somebody working for the government, whatever the kind of hazard, whatever the kind of event across the country, you can never say that it's not your problem. So I think the sheer magnitude of responsibility, accountability is overwhelming. Whether it is a chemical incident in a coastal town or a forest fire. And so, of course, there are systems at the local level, at the state level for dealing with that. But you still have to play a role in this. So I think that can be sometimes a bit overwhelming. Working for an international agency or an international NGO or any academic institution, you can very tightly define your mandate that this is what I'm responsible for, and please ask me questions about this. I think it's more difficult within the government to do that. If somebody right now calls me and says that I'm calling you from such and such place, there's an urban flood here, and my mother who needs dialysis is stuck there. Can you help me with that? Of course, there are local responders on the ground. Of course, there are people in the district, in the state. But I can't say that, it's not my problem.
Yeah.
I still have to call and make those connections work. And hopefully, so what the challenge is, how do you sort of cater to those expectations while also strengthening the overall system of managing this? So that's a challenge. And I'm sure my peers and colleagues in other countries feel the same challenge.
Yeah, in India is almost a continent by itself. No, it's how many
Indeed.
people are you in the National Disaster Management Authority?
So we are about 130 people in all in the National Disaster Management Authority. We also have a National Disaster Response Force aligned with the National Disaster Management Authority, which is basically a national team of responders. That is, of course, a very large number of people, but they are based in different locations in the country. There are about 12,000 of them. And then, in addition to that, of course, we also have state disaster management authorities. So they have capacities, and district disaster management authorities. So India is a federal country. So the main responsibility for disaster risk management is really of the states. So 130 people in Delhi may sound small for a large country, but in a federal structure, if our state authorities are strong, I think that is okay.
Thank you for giving us this overview of opportunities and challenges from the government level, because that helps also in our audience who are students of our Master of Humanitarian Aid, but who are already working in this field with the United Nations, maybe with the Red Cross movement or non-governmental organization, to have this perspective. And also when we interact, it's important to understand what is the reality of the other part. So at this moment in India nowadays, what would you say are the main priorities of NDMA?
So, I mean, we are in a pandemic year, so obviously getting the pandemic under control is a big priority. And there are so many new things that we haven't dealt with in the past. So it's a constant process of learning. Of course, there's a lot of past experience to draw upon, but we haven't seen anything in our lifetimes at this scale. And while the pandemic is happening, it's not as if other disasters have taken a break. Yeah. So you can put a city or a neighborhood under lockdown, but you don't lock down a cyclone, you don't lock down a flood. So how do you do disaster risk management, particularly disaster response, where in the background you have a pandemic and you have other hazards striking? So when you deploy your colleagues from National Disaster Response Force, this is perhaps the first time that they are not just responding, they also have to protect themselves from the virus itself. So they are at risk. So how do you adjust your protocols, your standard operating procedures to rise to this new challenge? So I think that's there. And of course, in the background also is the already observed and becoming more severe impacts of climate-related disasters. So preparing for that, how do we sort of prepare our cities for urban floods? How do we prepare for more intense events of rainfall, extreme rainfall, perhaps more frequent cyclones. Last year, we had 3 cyclones that made landfall in India. The average is about 2. I'm not saying that just on the basis of 1 year we can establish a trend, but it could happen. So I think there is past is no longer a good guide for the future. So getting ready for an increasingly uncertain future, I mean, risky, but also uncertain future is a priority.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for all this information about disaster management in these 30 years, the reality in the ground from a government perspective, and especially in such a huge country with so many states like India and many realities. That was really insightful and precious. To close this interview, I would like to ask 2 more personal questions to you. You told us at the beginning how you were a student in architecture, and then the earthquake happened, and you just went to help, to support, to rebuild a village there. So, but during all this career in disaster management, or maybe right now, have you ever dreamed or envisaged doing something else than disaster management?
Maybe art. I am an architect. I have some skills to sketch. Maybe music. Art and music is something that I have often fancied that I could have done. Having studied architecture, I wish I had done large architectural projects. So I have applied my architectural skills in this area, but not really done commercial architecture. But having said that, and of course, I miss being able to do those things and give them a lot of time. I can also say that in my chosen field now, disaster risk management day, I have never had more than a dull week, maybe a week, maybe a dull week, but it's always very interesting, very challenging. And after 30 years, I still consider myself a student of disaster risk management. There is so much more to learn. It helps you engage with a whole range of disciplines, different contexts, different approaches. So it's a very fulfilling line of work.
Thank you. And Kamal, for our students of KALU Institute who are listening to you now, what would be, out of these 30 years of experience that you have and so diverse, what would be the one piece of advice you would extract and like to give them?
Only piece of advice I will give is that talk to people. Talk to people who are at risk. Talk to people who manage risk every day. Talk to people who are living with risk, who've been affected by disasters. There is no substitute to that. I think I can give you a reading list, but going out there in the field and being with the people and listening, asking questions, there is no substitute to that. And your best work will always come on the basis of insights you gain from talking to people.
Thank you, Kamal. What a beautiful final words for our interview. Thank you so much for your time, for bringing all this knowledge and this passion, this commitment to disaster management. Thank you, Kamal.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, Emily. Thank you, and all the best to your students.
Thank you.